Somewhere inside the genome of ordinary people living in West Africa today, scientists found something that shouldn't be there. Not a mutation, not a disease marker, a signature belonging to an entire population of ancient humans that nobody has ever seen a single bone from. No skull, no skeleton, no fossil in any museum drawer anywhere on Earth. And yet the DNA evidence is unmistakable, a chunk of ancestry, inherited quietly for hundreds of thousands of years, from a lineage of humans that split off from the rest of us long before Neanderthals even existed. For decades, the story of human origins was told as a single, clean line, one population, one place, one triumphant migration out into the world. That story just cracked wide open. And once you understand how scientists found something with no bones, no fossils, and no physical evidence at all, purely by reading the patterns hidden inside living people's genomes, you'll understand why researchers are now calling this discovery one of the most significant rewrites of the human story in years. Stick with me, because this ghost in our genes changes more than just a textbook diagram. To understand why this discovery is so disorienting, you first need to understand the story it's overturning, because for most of the last several decades, the dominant scientific narrative about where humans came from was refreshingly simple. It's called the out-of-Africa hypothesis, and the basic version goes like this. Homo sapiens emerged somewhere in Africa roughly 200 to 300,000 years ago from a single ancestral population. That population eventually expanded outward, spreading across the continent and later out into Europe, Asia, and beyond, gradually replacing every other human species it encountered along the way. It's a linear story. One root, one trunk, branches spreading outward from a single clean point of origin. It's the version most of us grew up learning, and for good reason, it fit the fossil and genetic evidence available at the time remarkably well. But here's the thing about a story that's simple. It depends entirely on how much evidence you actually have, and Africa has historically been one of the hardest places on Earth to test that story directly. Ancient DNA degrades over time, and it degrades especially fast in hot, humid environments, exactly the conditions found across most of sub-Saharan Africa. Compare that to places like Siberia or Northern Europe, where cold, dry conditions have allowed scientists to pull remarkably well-preserved genetic material out of bones that are tens of thousands of years old. In large parts of West Africa specifically, ancient human remains and ancient DNA have historically been scarce, and what little material exists is often too degraded to sequence using traditional methods. That absence of physical evidence became the central obstacle standing between scientists and a genuinely complete picture of African population history, which happens to be the very foundation the entire human story is built on top of, since every human population currently on Earth traces its ancestry back through Africa eventually. So researchers tried something different. Instead of waiting for a fossil that might never surface, a team of computational biologists, led by Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman at the University of California, Los Angeles, decided to look for evidence of an unknown ancient population, using an entirely different kind of proof, statistical inheritance patterns buried inside the genomes of people alive right now. Their method didn't rely on comparing modern DNA against reference material from an actual fossil, the way earlier landmarks discoveries about Neanderthals and Denisovans had worked. It relied purely on internal statistical fingerprints, patterns of genetic variation that simply don't make sense unless you assume an unaccounted for, deeply diverged population contributed DNA to the mix at some point in the past. Here's the analogy that makes this method easier to picture. Imagine you're looking at a finished patchwork quilt, and most of the fabric pieces clearly match known bolts of cloth you can identify by pattern and texture. But scattered throughout the quilt are a handful of patches that don't match anything in your reference collection at all, are different weave, different dye, different age. You've never seen the original bolt of fabric those patches came from, and you may never find it. But their presence in the quilt is undeniable, and their distinct pattern tells you something concrete about a source material you don't otherwise have access to. That's essentially what these researchers were doing with genomic data, identifying stretches of DNA in modern genomes that simply didn't match any known ancestral population, and using statistical modeling to characterize the mystery source those patches must have come from. Published in the journal Science Advances, their analysis focused on whole genome data from several West African populations, specifically the Yoruba and Esan peoples of Nigeria, the Mende people of Sierra Leone, and Gambian populations. Across all four of these genetically distinct groups, the same signal kept appearing, a consistent, statistically robust trace of ancestry from an archaic, extinct hominin lineage that doesn't match Neanderthals, doesn't match Denisovans, and doesn't match any previously documented human relative. The researchers estimated that this mystery ancestry makes up somewhere around 8% of the genetic makeup of these modern West African populations, an amount that isn't a rounding error or a statistical fluke. It's a substantial, structurally consistent signal running through multiple separate populations at once. If you're the kind of person who finds it wild that scientists can prove an entire vanished species existed without a single physical bone to point to, go ahead and hit that like button, because this entire discovery rests on exactly that kind of evidence. What makes this finding even stranger is the timeline involved. Based on how deeply diverged this genetic signature appears to be, researchers estimate that this ghost population split off from the ancestors of modern humans somewhere in the range of hundreds of thousands of years before Neanderthals themselves branched away from our shared lineage. Some estimates place the divergence considerably earlier than 600,000 years ago, potentially pushing back close to, or even beyond, the point where Homo erectus itself was still walking the earth. And then, remarkably, at some point significantly later, this separated population came back into contact with the ancestors of modern humans and interbred with them, leaving behind a genetic legacy that has quietly persisted in West African population S for tens of thousands of years without anyone ever noticing it was there. This wasn't actually the first hint that something like this existed either. Earlier genetic research going back to at least 2016 had already flagged unusual genetic variation in West African populations that didn't cleanly fit the standard population history models scientists were using at the time. But those earlier signals were harder to pin down precisely, more of a statistical oddity than a fully characterized discovery. The 2020 UCLA study was the first to build a detailed, defensible model actually describing what that anomaly represented, an entire distinct hominin lineage, not just background noise in the data. And then, remarkably, the story got even bigger. In 2025, a completely separate team of researchers publishing in the journal Nature Genetics took this general idea of ghost ancestry and pushed it to a scale that startled even scientists already familiar with the West African findings. Using a newly developed statistical tool called COBRA, designed specifically to model how ancient populations could split apart and then later merge back together, researchers analyzed thousands of full genomes from the 1000 Genomes Project, a massive international genetic database spanning populations across the entire globe, not just West Africa. Their analysis suggested that roughly 300,000 years ago, two deeply divergent ancestral human populations reunited after an extraordinarily long separation. One of those populations contributed around 80% of the genetic material found in humans today. The other, the ghost population, contributed the remaining 20%, an even larger share of our ancestry than the earlier West African study had found, and this time detected across humanity broadly, not confined to one region. To put that 20% figure in real perspective, consider this comparison directly from the research team. Neanderthals are estimated to have split from the ancestors of modern humans roughly 600,000 years ago, and interbreeding with Neanderthals left only about 2 to 5% of their DNA behind in the genomes of people with Eurasian ancestry today. This newly identified ghost lineage, according to the COBRA analysis, split off from our ancestors far earlier, potentially as long as 1.5 million years ago, and yet left behind a genetic contribution roughly 4 to 10 times larger than what Neanderthals contributed. In other words, a huge percentage of what makes up a modern human genome traces back to a population that was, genetically speaking, more different from us than a Neanderthal was, and we only found out it existed within the last few years. If a story like this, where the scale of the discovery keeps expanding every time researchers dig deeper, is exactly the kind of science coverage you're here for, this is a good moment to subscribe, because we cover discoveries like this one regularly. So how does a population contribute 20% of humanity's entire genetic ancestry without anyone finding a single trace of them until now? Researchers point to a phenomenon population geneticists sometimes compare to what's known informally as the Ghenghis Khan effect. It's a well-documented pattern in human genetics. Roughly 1 in every 200 men alive today carries a Y chromosome traceable directly back to Ghenghis Khan. Not because of any single dramatic event, but because of how reproductive success compounds across many generations once a lineage gains even a modest advantage. Evolutionary mergers between populations can work in a similar, though far more ancient and gradual way, when two deeply diverged populations reunite after being separated for hundreds of thousands of years. The genetic material from either group doesn't necessarily blend evenly. If the ghost population's DNA happened to carry variants that offered some kind of survival advantage, resistance to regional diseases, different metabolic adaptations, traits suited to environments the other population hadn't encountered, those genetic contributions could spread and persist disproportionately across many thousands of years, becoming deeply embedded in the ancestry of everyone who came after, even as the ghost population itself, as a distinct, identifiable group, effectively disappeared. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how much rigorous work goes into ruling out simpler, more mundane explanations. Before a claim like this gets published in a serious journal, before researchers can credibly claim they've found evidence of an entirely unknown archaic population, they have to systematically eliminate every less exotic possibility that could produce a similar statistical signature. Could this unusual genetic pattern simply reflect ordinary population structure within Africa, distinct groups that were never truly separate species, just isolated long enough to develop some genetic differences before reconnecting? Could it be an artifact of incomplete reference data, given how comparatively few African genomes had been deeply sequenced compared to European and Asian populations for much of the last 2 decades? Could it be statistical noise generated by the modeling method itself, rather than a genuine historical signal? Researchers tested their models against multiple alternative demographic scenarios, cross-validated their findings using different statistical approaches, and confirmed the signal held up consistently across 4 genetically distinct West African populations, rather than appearing as an isolated quirk in just one dataset. That kind of methodical elimination process is exactly why this finding gained traction within the scientific community, rather than being dismissed as a fluke. The signal wasn't just present, it was stubbornly, repeatedly present, no matter how researchers tried to explain it away. It's also worth comparing this discovery method to how scientists first confirmed the existence of Denisovans, since that earlier breakthrough is often treated as the gold standard for identifying a previously unknown human relative. In that case, researchers had an actual physical specimen to work with, a single fingerbone fragment discovered in Siberia's Denisova cave, from which scientists extracted genetic material that didn't match any known human population, confirming an entirely new branch of the human family tree practically overnight, backed by a tangible fossil anyone could hold in their hand. This West African discovery, and the subsequent 2025 global analysis, worked in the complete opposite direction. No fossil, no cave, no bone fragment to anchor the claim physically. Instead, the entire case rests on statistical inference alone, patterns in living people's genomes, that are only explicable if you assume a population existed that nobody has ever directly observed. That's a genuinely higher bar to clear scientifically, since there's no physical specimen to double-check the genetic story against, which makes the fact that multiple independent research teams using different statistical tools and different datasets keep arriving at strikingly similar conclusions all the more significant. This raises the obvious next question, the one that's currently sending archaeologists back into the field with renewed purpose. Who were these people? Right now, nobody actually knows, and that's precisely why researchers are describing this as one of the most tantalizing open questions in all of human evolutionary science. Since the genetic signal indicates a population that diverged somewhere in the general range of the Middle Pleistocene, a period roughly spanning from about 780,000 to around 125,000 years ago, researchers have started looking more closely at fossil specimens from that era that have never been fully assigned a clear place in the human family tree. Species like Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis, along with a scattering of other Middle Pleistocene remains found across Africa that don't cleanly match any well-established category, are now considered plausible candidates for what this ghost population's physical remains might eventually look like, if they're ever found at all. Sites like Bodo and Herto in Ethiopia, Olorgesailie in Kenya, and Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, all of which have already produced important but incomplete pieces of the human origin puzzle, are exactly the kind of locations researchers are now revisiting with this new genetic target in mind. There's also a broader theoretical framework that's helped make sense of how a discovery like this fits into the bigger picture of African prehistory. A separate study published in Nature in 2023 proposed what researchers called a weakly structured stem model for the origin of Homo sapiens, essentially arguing that for close to 1 million years, different early human groups lived somewhat separately across different regions of Africa, geographically divided by deserts, mountain ranges, and vast distances, developing distinct traits and characteristics in relative isolation. But crucially, these populations weren't separated so completely that they became entirely different species incapable of interbreeding. They remained similar enough that whenever their paths crossed again, whether through climate shifts opening new migration corridors or population movements bringing groups back into contact, they could and did merge their genetic lineages back together. Under that model, Africa during this period looked less like a single population steadily growing in one place, and more like a patchwork of semi-isolated groups splitting apart and periodically reconnecting across hundreds of thousands of years, exactly the kind of messy, structured history that would produce ghost lineages like the ones now being detected in modern genomes. This distinction matters enormously for how scientists think about human origins going forward, because it fundamentally changes the shape of the story. Humanity isn't a single tree with one trunk and branches spreading neatly outward. It looks much closer to a braided river, multiple channels of ancestry running in parallel for enormous stretches of time, splitting, diverging, and periodically merging back together, before finally converging into the population that exists today. And it's worth being precise here about what has and hasn't been established, because the IS is exactly the kind of discovery that's easy to overstate. Researchers haven't found bones. They haven't found a name for this population, a location researchers can point to with certainty, or a detailed picture of what these people looked like, or how they lived. What they've found is a rigorously modeled statistical signature, consistent across multiple independent studies and multiple modern populations, strong enough that serious researchers across several institutions are now treating its existence as effectively established, even while its physical identity remains completely unknown. There's also a reason this discovery matters well beyond pure academic curiosity about the distant past, because ghost ancestry doesn't just sit passively in our genomes as historical trivia, it can carry real biological consequences into the present. Researchers studying this kind of archaic introgression have found that some inherited variants from ancient divergent populations affect immune system function, shaping how modern human bodies respond to certain pathogens. Others appear linked to metabolic processes, including how the body handles lipids and sugars, differences that could plausibly connect back to conditions faced by populations living in entirely different environments hundreds of thousands of years ago. Some research has even pointed toward potential effects on brain development and neural architecture, though this remains a much newer and less settled area of investigation. None of this means scientists have fully mapped out what this ghost ancestry does for people today. That work is still very much ongoing, but it does mean the discovery isn't purely historical. It has genuine relevance for fields like precision medicine, where understanding a patient's full ancestral genetic background, including deeply ancient contributions like this one, is increasingly recognized as important context rather than an irrelevant detail. Medical genetics as a field has historically drawn most of its reference data from populations of European descent, and discoveries like this one are part of a broader, overdue push to build genomic databases that actually reflect the full depth and diversity of human ancestry, particularly across Africa, where that depth turns out to run far deeper than almost anyone had assumed. So where does this leave the search going forward? Scientists are actively refining the statistical tools used to detect these kinds of signals, hoping to characterize this ghost population's genetic contribution with even greater precision than current methods allow. Archaeologists are returning to fossil sites across Africa with a genuinely new question in mind, searching specifically for remains that might eventually be connected back to this genetic phantom through improved dating techniques, protein analysis, and increasingly sensitive methods for extracting ancient DNA from bones and even from sediment where no visible remains survive at all. And geneticists continue combing through modern genomic datasets from populations around the world, testing whether traces of this ghost lineage or others like it show up in unexpected places beyond West Africa and the broader global samples already examined. There's a certain humility built into this whole discovery that's worth sitting with too. For all the confidence genomic statistics can offer, this ghost population remains, quite literally, faceless. We don't know what they looked like, how they spoke, what they buried their dead with, or whether they even resembled us closely enough that we'd recognize them as human at a glance. All we know is that they existed, that they mattered enormously to who we are today, and that they're still, for now, waiting to be found. What's genuinely remarkable about this entire story is the method itself, because it represents something new in how we're allowed to ask questions about our own deep past. For most of the history of human origins research, the fossil record set the pace. Discoveries happened when someone got lucky enough to dig in the right place at the right time. This discovery flipped that relationship. The genetic evidence arrived first, describing a population in statistical detail before a single physical trace of them has ever been found. And now it's the fossil hunters chasing the genome, rather than the other way around. Somewhere in Africa, buried in sediment that hasn't been excavated yet, or perhaps sitting misclassified in a museum collection already, the physical evidence of this ghost population is very likely still out there waiting. We just now know, with real statistical confidence, exactly what we're looking for. If discoveries like this, where scientists can prove an entire vanished human population, existed using nothing but the DNA of people alive today, are the kind of story that pulls you in, make sure you're subscribed, because the hunt for this ghost's bones is only just getting started, and we'll be here to cover it the moment something turns up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.